get a little notification in a second. There you go. So yes, we're super happy to welcome Deron Carter here from Linn-Benton Community College. My colleague Sammy will be giving him a slightly better introduction, considering that they are geologist buds together, so know each other a little bit better. But so just as an overall kind of overview of the webinar, this will be about an hour, so you'll be free to go around 6:30, 6:30 Mountain Time, that is. So this meeting is recorded. You won't be recorded, as I mentioned, just our speaker as well as the slides. We'll put this up on our YouTube channel for future reference. You can definitely check that out later. Once I get it posted, I will send out the link to all of you via the event, so you'll get it in your inbox in a day or so. And we'll take questions. We'll have the presentation, and then we'll have questions at the end. So feel free to either just, hold on to your question or write it in the chat so you don't forget. You can also message me directly. I think you can do that on Google Hangouts. Maybe you can't. Anyway, or you can, so I can read it out at the end, or you can come off mute and ask your question in person. I will ask that everyone stays on mute. And if I find you're not on mute, I probably would just mute you so we don't have background noise. So I think that's it. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sammy.
Great. Thanks, Catalin. Yeah, thanks all for joining the call tonight. It's really, really exciting to have really such a cool geologic talk here at the webinar. So once a month, the Friends of the Owyhee, we've been hosting a webinar about in the middle of the month. About half of them are stargazing, where we live in a beautiful dark night skies area. And then the other half, we've invited guest speakers like Deron here tonight. So very excited to have Deron. He is a geoscience faculty member, teaches geology at Linn-Benton Community College out of Albany, right? And this is part of his dissertation work, right, from Central Washington University, looking at catastrophic flooding of pluvial lakes, Alvord and Coyote. So, and I love the title of the talk, Deron, a gush and rush, catastrophic flooding from Ice Age lakes, Alvord and Coyote into the Owyhee River. So now all of you friends of the Owyhee just heard the buzzword of exactly how what Deron was studying ties into the watershed that we here at Friends of the Owyhee steward and spend a lot of time walking around on, recreating, and of course are advocates for the conservation of this land. So also Deron and I, we are geoscience faculty together. Back when I was full-time at Treasure Valley Community College, Deron and I met at in Madison, Wisconsin, of all places, at a conference that is called, it's for the National Association of Geoscience Teachers. So this is a bunch of geologists that are also super excited about teaching the stuff. And we attended what's called an Earth Educator Rendezvous. It was a really powerful time to meet a whole bunch of other geoscience faculty. I had actually just moved from Wisconsin the year before, so it was sort of returning. And Deron, it was really important to meet you over here in Oregon for some camaraderie, some 2-year geoscience faculty happenings over here. Then at the time, I recalled him saying something about this weird area in southeastern Oregon called the Owyhee. And at the time, it didn't mean a lot to me. I mean, it really did. I had never visited the area, but then of course I came to Treasure Valley Community College and started with Tim Davis adventuring out here and meeting all of you friends. And I'm so excited to finally hear all of the story straight from Deron rather than just reading the paper a couple times. So without further ado, thank you, Deron, for joining us tonight, and look forward to taking notes on all the details.
Well, thanks a lot, Sammy. And thanks to the Friends of the Owyhee for inviting me today. And I'm super excited to be here. And as Sammy said, so I'm calling from Corvallis, and it's great to see a lot of people from all over the place, but lots of lovers of this beautiful landscape here. And as Sammy mentioned, I teach geology courses at Linn-Benton Community College in Albany, Oregon. And my focus is kind of on teaching, but it's this is so great to be able to go back and revisit some of my research. And it is a while ago. You know, the research is coming from 2005 and 6, so a little more recent than the flood, we'll learn. But and before I get started here, I do want to, so I don't forget, I want to give thanks to my wonderful advisor at Central Washington University, Dr. Lisa Ely, and then Dr. Jim O'Connor, who's in Portland with the U.S. Geological Survey, and Dr. Meredith Reheis, who actually kind of did some of the initial recon of this, and she's out of Denver and is kind of the expert, so to speak, of Great Basin Ice Age lakes that we'll learn more about here. So I'm really excited to present a gush and a rush catastrophic flooding from Ice Age Lakes Alvord and Coyote into the Owyhee River. So here's just a brief outline of the talk today. So I'm going to set the context here by looking at a couple other large floods that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Then we'll visit the study area and talk about the hypothesis testing, look at evidence for the flood. So we'll look at things from, where the flood came from, where it went, and just all the, just really, to me, spectacular evidence for it. Part of our research here was also trying to determine the age of the flood, and we'll talk a little about some of the geochronology methods that we used. Also look a little at the modeling of the flood. So we did some modeling here to try to compare its size to other floods, and then just some significance here. And along the way, hopefully we'll have some beautiful imagery of this great landscape. So I'm going to start out by talking about a different flood, and many of you are probably familiar with the Missoula Floods that happened at the end of the last ice age here, the end of the last glacial maximum. And this is, kind of 13, 15, 17,000 years ago. And at this time here, we had a big ice sheet over the kind of Canada and into the United States, over the northern part of North America. And the ice sheet here in our neck of the woods extended down and carved out the Puget Sound. You can see where Seattle, where you can reference where Seattle is. And one of the lobes of the ice sheet blocked and dammed the Clark Fork River and created a huge lake, Glacial Lake Missoula. And this lake flooded and traveled down the kind of the brown area you can see here, carving out some spectacular gorges and features. And where I am, it backed up the Willamette Valley where I'm at right now. And if I was in a Missoula flood in Corvallis, I would be under about 200 feet of water, which is pretty cool and remarkable to see. And these floods happened, multiple times, probably upmost of 100 floods. And so these are some of the largest floods on record. And we can see geologic evidence of these floods. One place we can look here is we can look for actually the source. This here is a picture of the University of Montana campus in Missoula, and we can see what we call the strand lines, or the really shorelines here that are etched into the hillside that would have represented the high stand of the lake. And of course, the lake drained and refilled and drained and refilled, and left just some remarkable features in the landscape. We see some things like these giant ripple marks here in the Camas Prairie on this image. And just for scale, you can see a semi there. And these are really what we'd say scale independent here. So you could go to a little creek and see little ripple marks in a gravel bed or a sandy creek bed today that might just be a few centimeters. centimeters high, and these are way bigger, but it just gives you an idea of the scale. It can start helping you get an idea of the scale of the flood. And then throughout eastern Washington, we have lots of abandoned channels. So we can see these big canyons here in the other image. These are the Drumheller channels, and there's no rivers or streams going through these channels. They were carved by the floods. And we can see a lot of the bedrock here has just been, you can imagine, just plucked as this huge rush of water traveled through. Up in my neck of the woods here in the Willamette Valley, one of my favorite state parks is Geology State Park, which I just love. It's outside of McMinnville, and it's called Erratic Rock State Natural Area. And really, there's not much there, a short trail, and then you have this huge rock. But the significance of this rock is pretty remarkable. This rock here is a metamorphic rock. And in the Willamette Valley, you don't really find any metamorphic rocks. And this one here is Proterozoic in age. So it's like, we're talking over 1 billion years old. And this came to rest in the Willamette Valley here because it was rafted on an iceberg that was carried in one of the floods. And of course, we know ice floats, right? And so this thing would have been, this iceberg with this huge boulder on it would have been floating on the surface of one of the floods. And then as the iceberg got deposited, as the flood started waning, the ice, of course, melted and left this erratic. And you can find these erratics all around the Willamette Valley. And they really act, not only they're really cool, but they act as kind of the high water mark for a lot of them, some of the Missoula Floods. So another flood that maybe you're familiar with is the Bonneville Flood. The Bonneville Flood happened about 17,000 years ago, so probably earlier than the Missoula Floods. Although, I understand there's some newer research out suggesting there may have been some much older Missoula Floods. The Bonneville Floods happened, still a big flood, had still a huge water source, but kind of a little different mechanism. So it's still 17,000 years ago. We're still coming out of the kind of our last, what we call our last glacial maximum. So kind of coming out of the last most recent ice age. And in the Great Basin, which, makes up Nevada, Utah, parts of Idaho, and Oregon, we would have had these huge lakes we call pluvial lakes. And these lakes would have formed in these big basins, and they would form basically because the evaporation rates were a lot lower because the climate was cooler, and so water could just form. And many of us today, I'm sure, are familiar with the Great Salt Lake. And the Great Salt Lake, if we went back 17,000 years ago, we'd call that Lake Bonneville, and we could see it occupied much of Utah here, as you can kind of see on the slide here. So, so Lake Bonneville was the largest of these Great Basin lakes, these pluvial lakes. And at one point, Lake Bonneville rose high enough that it kind of overtopped its, what we call its sill at Red Rock Pass. So think of that being like if you leave your bathtub on and then water would kind of come gushing out over the side of the bathtub. That would be what we'd call the sill. And so water spilled out through Red Rock Pass, and it traveled down the Snake River and into the Columbia River, and just left some spectacular flood deposits here. You can see this huge boulder with a person for scale here. You can see this whole surface mantled with boulders. If you've ever been to Twin Falls, Idaho, just walk around the surface of Twin Falls, Idaho, and you see all these boulders, and those are all deposits of the Bonneville Flood. And then also seeing just these bedrock surfaces here that have just been stripped of any soil, and as the water came through and just carved and kind of what we'd say fluted the bedrock here. And so these are we see during the last ice age. We refer to kind of this time period as the late-Pleistocene. In the late Pleistocene here, we see there's lots of evidence of these floods from glacial dams, and then just from these big pluvial lakes rising and overflowing. And I mentioned my colleague Meredith Reheis at the USGS. She led a field trip years ago down here, did a little recon, and found some evidence of maybe a similar type of flood down in the Owyhee River Basin. And one of the, Sammy mentioned the Earth Educators Rendezvous, and that's one of many professional organizations that are out there for geologists. Another one that's a little more informal is called Friends of the Pleistocene, where there is actually a songbook about singing songs about the Pleistocene. And it's and Meredith was leading a field trip down here, and kind of came up with an idea that had never really been tested, and this was really intriguing, and it got me down into the Owyhee River Basin. And some of you might be familiar with just the Pillars of Rome down here, which is right on the Owyhee, right by Rome, Oregon. And the rocks here aren't flood deposits. They're much older than the flood we're going to be looking at, but deposits from a big lake, but still really cool, just to set the stage for kind of the landscape that I know many of you know about. And so how I got involved, I took about 6 years off between getting my bachelor's degree and then starting grad school. And I was I did a lot of environmental education and a lot of seasonal work that took me to some great places. And I was ready to delve into grad school. And I applied to a couple of different grad schools and got in, and was debating where to go. And there were pros and cons of each. And then my advisor, at that point, she was my advisor, but Lisa Ely at Central Washington University called me up and said, "Hey, Deron, if you come to Central, we have a week-long, I can get you on a week-long rafting trip down the Owyhee River." And that was it. That was the selling point for me. And that is how I actually chose grad school, was to get on this rafting trip, to look at this flood. And then there's just some other great floods related to lava dams and landslides, which is a whole nother story, and another talk, Sammy, at some point. And so I was really fortunate. As part of my research, I got 2 river trips. I got to participate in 2 scientific research trips down the river from Rome to Leslie Gulch. And so in this work here, I just also want to acknowledge a couple other folks here. So a lot of work down here was pioneered in the Owyhee, where we're going to visit here in a second, and the Alvord Basin by this guy on the bottom here, I.C. Russell, who was one of the first geologists in the I believe it was the late 1800s, early 1900s, who was actually on horseback traveling through the Alvord and doing some of the first kind of reconnaissance geology. And then the guy up here in the upper right is with a hard hat on, is J. Harlan Bretz, and he had the hypothesis of the Missoula Floods, which is wildly unpopular, but certainly one of many geologists to work on it and kind of come up with the whole idea. And then this person here is Vic Baker, the last person in the upper left, and he is kind of carried on with many other geologists, carried on the work of J. Harlan Bretz on the Missoula Floods by looking at dating them, looking at all sorts of other flood features and flood hydrology. And he was introduced to me the first time I met Vic at a scientific conference. He was introduced to me as my geologic grandfather, because both Lisa, my advisor, and Jim O'Connor Vic was their advisor in grad school, and so they were with me, and they introduced Vic as my geologic grandfather. So I just want to say I am just so happy to be part of telling another flood story that all three of these geologists did. And there's a famous quote by Isaac Newton that this work wouldn't have happened without standing on the shoulders of giants. Okay, so let's get into the talk here and the actual research of the flood. So what we're looking at here is a map of basically a lot of the Owyhee River Basin, and we can see Lake Alvord here. We can see the study area, of course, and then this is probably about 17,000 years ago what the region would have looked like. It would have been cooler. We have Steens, so we're looking at the Alvord Basin, and then just to the east of that is the Coyote Basin, and these are mostly dry today. But back in in the late Pleistocene, they would have contained fairly large pluvial lakes like Lake Bonneville. And I was fortunate. I got to spend a ton of time kind of doing field work, which is just a vast area between the Alvord Basin and then all the way to the Owyhee River here. Just beautiful country. And so I want to show this here because this has a kind of three really important landmarks that for us to keep in mind today to keep us on track. And one is Lake Alvord. So we can see that's the lake that is kind of running, the long lake that goes into Nevada, running north to south. And then we have Pluvial Lake Coyote, which is a much smaller basin here. And then Big Sand Gap is another important feature here. Okay. And so big picture here is we had Lake Alvord that filled up, spilled through Big Sand Gap, overwhelmed Lake Coyote, and triggered a huge flood that traveled down Crooked Creek, which is a tributary to the Owyhee River. And so here's a image of the study area here. This is from near the summit of the Trout Creek Mountains, and we can see here in the horizon you can see the snow, and that's the white there, and that is Steens Mountain. And then we can see the Alvord Basin here. We can see it's dry. It's the playa surface, so dry, but that would have held a lake. And then we can see where the Coyote Basin playa is today to give us reference here. And so these in the late Pleistocene would have held huge lakes. And Steens Mountain here, beautiful area. This photo I took from standing on the surface of the Alvord playa. Oh, I'm sorry about the sound here. I didn't know that was going to be on here, and hopefully this isn't going to be on here. But it's a steep escarpment and would have held glaciers during the last glacial maximum. And Steens Mountain provided much of the drainage area for Lake Alvord. So during the Ice Age, we would have seen big creeks pouring down into where I was standing on the playa surface. Would have been a big lake. Some of the evidence on Steens Mountain, if you haven't been, it's just a really super cool place. But this is Kiger Gorge. It's one of the many of the huge gorges on Steens Mountain. And this thing would have been full of ice, been full of a big glacier at this time during the late Pleistocene here. And there's many more of these big Indian Gorge, many other ones that I'm forgetting as well. Okay, so we had a big lake as in the Alvord Basin, a big pluvial lake here. Now connecting one interesting place that we looked at here was we noticed on maps and air photos there was this channel that connected the Alvord Basin to the Coyote Basin, and that's what we're looking at here. So we're looking towards Steens Mountain on the horizon here, and this is called Big Sand Gap. And this is a really a cool place that you get to it by getting on the playa surface of the Alvord Desert and then just driving about, I think it was about 7 miles, if I remember right, to Big Sand Gap across the playa surface. And I remember doing this in a truck I was using, and it was just like I'm thinking of what a cool commute to work I had, and a real unique commute I had here. So so Big Sand Gap again is going to connect Alvord Basin with Coyote Basin here. So one thing we looked at we wanted to figure out about how big Lake Alvord was. And so the way we did that is we looked at shorelines. We wanted to find shorelines that represented the high stands of Lake Alvord. And we can see some images here of some of the shorelines. Here we can kind of see these terraces in the upper photo, and we can see 2 shorelines right here, kind of flat. So wave action would have etched these shorelines out. And we weren't really able to get a exact age, but in geology, one dating technique we often use is called relative dating. And this just lets us know, one thing is older than another. And we can make some pretty good observations by looking at things like how much soil has developed in some of these shorelines, what the rocks look like through what we call desert varnish. And we can also look at something called carbonate development here, which is the precipitation of calcium carbonate on in soils on the shorelines here. And what we found here is we found kind of 2 groups of shorelines. So we found shorelines, kind of 5 sets of shorelines at these different elevations. But what was really important here is there were 2 groups, and we had the higher shorelines and the lower shorelines. And the higher shorelines were, let's take a look at a couple more shorelines here. I'll get to that in a second. But we can see some more shorelines here. So really well developed. We look on these as we walk through them. We can see nice kind of, you almost think you're on like a beach, like a lake, rocky lake beach. So real kind of rounded, polished gravel. Really helps you visualize what where the lake would have been in the past. And then we went over to Lake Coyote, and we wanted to do the same thing. What are we seeing in Lake Coyote? And are we seeing one kind of age of shorelines or multiple ages like Lake Alvord? And Lake Coyote is much smaller, we can see on the map. And what we ended up seeing is like Lake Alvord, we had 2 sets of shorelines of different ages, okay? And, so here, a little different elevations, but that's not abnormal since a little lower in elevation than the basin's a little lower elevation than the Alvord Basin. But this gives you an idea here of some of the kind of rounded, you can imagine waves just working this, rounding these pebbles like you've probably seen on a shoreline too. And so this image here is this little figure here is kind of showing us these how we kind of have these 2 what we'll call suites of shorelines. So in the Alvord Basin, we have kind of these upper shorelines, which represent, we think, an older lake cycle, an older, higher lake stand based on our observations of relative dating. And then we have some of these younger shorelines here, more recent shorelines, again, based on things like looking at soil formation, weathering on the cobbles and the terraces. And we see the same thing in the Coyote Basin. We see a high stand that is older than the more recent shorelines of the late Pleistocene. So that's kind of cool. We're seeing, both these lakes kind of seem to rise and fall somewhat together at different times in the late Pleistocene. Okay, so we're back here to Big Sand Gap, and this is a map here. And just to orient ourselves, kind of in the upper corner of the map, the upper corner of the map where it says flow from the Alvord Basin, that would be Lake Alvord. And then here we're looking at Big Sand Gap. We kind of see it's a big channel here, and with some lake deposits, some delta deposits, some more recent alluvial fans. And then, but we can kind of continue to see this channel here that goes to the Coyote Basin here. And so, so in our story here is basically we would have had one of these high stands of Lake Alvord, and it would have spilled through Big Sand Gap. So Big Sand Gap wouldn't have been able to contain some of these higher stands of Lake Alvord, would have spilled into the Coyote Basin. So this is kind of showing us a model of the overflow sequence. So Lake Alvord would have reached a high stand, and eventually probably, you know, eroded through Big Sand Gap or reached a elevation higher than Big Sand Gap, and it would have spilled into the Coyote Basin here. In the Coyote Basin, because it was so much smaller, it couldn't contain all this water. The water had to go somewhere, and this was our rush and a gush here. We would have had a big flood that would have poured down into the Owyhee River drainage here, down Crooked Creek. And eventually then, once the water pours out, these two lakes, their lake levels would have kind of equilibrated. So here's an image from Lake Coyote, a geologic map here. So we see the modern playa surface, and then kind of the yellow represents where the shoreline would have been kind of shortly post-flood. And what we noticed in the Coyote Basin is there were two kind of outlets that water poured out of, a northern outlet and then kind of an eastern outlet here. And these outlets suggest that after the big initial flood, there probably would have been water flowing out of Lake Coyote as kind of a stream or river for a continuous amount of time. So again, big picture here, Lake Alvord spills into Lake Coyote. Lake Coyote is just totally overwhelmed and flows out of its kind of north and then eastern parts here. And what we think here is that this water would have traveled just kind of as a big broad sheet for a long period of time. There we didn't see much evidence of like a old channel until it reached the Crooked Creek channel, which is a tributary to the Owyhee River. And the flood would have released about 20 cubic kilometers of water and probably would have happened over about 3 days or so. And we see, we don't see a lot of evidence right after as the water poured out of Lake Coyote. We don't see a lot of evidence for the flood until it starts getting into kind of the canyons of Crooked Creek. And that's what we'll take a look at next year. And that's so we're looking here at the headwaters of Crooked Creek. And so this here is a map. And if you're familiar with the area here, we can see where Burns Junction is. And the gap, I haven't been there in years, but had great milkshakes when I was there. If it's still, hopefully it's still the little roadside cafe. But here's Highway 95 North. And then kind of continuing along Highway 95 North, and we can see the Owyhee River for reference up in here, and Rome would have just been, I think, just off the map. But what we see here is kind of the flood pouring in here into the Crooked Creek drainage here. And some of our first evidence we saw, we named the Stoddard Bar, and it was basically after a big ranch out there that let us access their land to look at the flood, and just a really neat family, the Stoddards, and they were just so kind and gracious to us in supporting our work here. And we can kind of see this little lump in this channel here, and we can imagine this channel today not carrying much water. And as we investigate this lump, we can see we have this jumble of boulders here. And these boulders, some of them are like 2 meters, 6 feet or more, 6-7 feet in diameter. And these are this is telling us a lot of water came through here to move these boulders. These water came through and plucked up these rocks and deposited them where they are. We continue along here, and so we continue along downstream as we move to the Owyhee River. The red triangles here are all like flood evidence that we found. And we move into another kind of boulder bar, flood bar here that we call Anderson Bar. And this is named after another ranch that allowed us to do some field work here. And this, to me, was just some really impressive evidence of the flood here. And this is a colleague of mine, and we can see these boulders here. Some of them were close to 10, 12 feet across, and they were plucked up by the flood and deposited. And in some cases, some of them display what we call an imbrication. You can kind of see the stacking. And again, this is something you could go to a river. You've probably seen this before, even a little creek, and see little cobbles in that creek stacked in the direction of water flow. So in this picture here, we can imagine flow would have gone from the right to the left, just over Cassie's head here. So again, there are a lot of water moving here. And these are often deposited right where we have a constriction and water is flowing through, and then it opens up and stuff gets deposited pretty rapidly. Picture of me on top of one of these things. We move along downstream here, and we still see some more boulders, not quite as impressive, but still big here. And we're seeing multiple surfaces here. So these may have been deposited as the water kind of waned down, deposited down in kind of different time periods of the flood. And this image here is just showing us the modern day, the black line is the modern day base elevation of the Crooked Creek. And all the triangles here are showing us the flood evidence here. So things like boulders and stripped bedrock surfaces that the flood would have created. And so it gives you an idea of how high the flood was above the elevation of Crooked Creek. And we can use these, we call these high water marks here, or paleo stage indicators. We can use these to help us model kind of how big the flood was, or quantify, put a number on how much water was moving through here. And we did an analysis called a step-backwater analysis, same type of analysis done on the Bonneville floods and the Missoula floods, where we're looking for a tight constriction here. And we know where the dots are, where some of the high water marks were, and we can kind of map out the geometry of the channel. And if we know the height of the high water marks and the geometry of the channel, we can run a kind of a computer model to figure out how high the water would be and how much was flowing through the channel to match the geometry of the channel and the high water marks here. And so we did that in a couple different places. We did it at Big Sand Gap, where water flowed out of Lake Alvord, and then we did it right kind of by that first flood bar, the Stoddard Bar, where on Highway 95, where the flood would have been constricted to a pretty tight channel here. And we found some discrepancies. We found that basically the maximum amount of water flowing out of Lake Alvord could be about 10,000 cubic meters per second. And we found on the Crooked Creek, it could be much higher, 40,000. And this didn't make a lot of sense because, how the heck could you get so much more water if there's downstream, right? Basically this number should be 10,000 or less because there's not another source of water contributing to the flood. And so we explain this by maybe this is older floods from some of those higher shorelines that we saw that we know are older. And so maybe there are older, bigger floods, or maybe during the flood, the flood actually carved Crooked Creek deeper. And that would kind of mess with the geometry and the calculations. We also tried to figure out the age of the floods here. And the floods here are we did a dating technique called cosmogenic dating on many of the flood deposits. And this is a type of dating where we're looking at the accumulation of cosmic radiation from outer space. And it basically is a surface exposure dating technique. So the longer something is exposed to the surface, kind of the more accumulation of cosmic radiation it has. And in the cases we were dating, we were the more cosmic radiation kind of corresponds to the accumulation of an isotope of helium. Well, the sad news is we were hoping if it was all one flood of one age, all these numbers here on the last column should be the same, and they certainly weren't. So we think we maybe had some issues with the samples. But lo and behold, on my last field visit out there years ago, I was wandering around in the Alvord, and I'm a natural history buff too, like many of you. And I just enjoyed like trying to make as many natural history sightings, not just the rocks, but the life too. And I saw I think a collared lizard actually, which was just amazing. I'd never seen one before. And it was kind of perched up, and I went to go investigate, and I found this white layer. And lo and behold, this white layer is an ash layer. It's what we call a tephra. And we dug down here into the tephra, and tephras can be, they're like fingerprints in geology. So we can use them. They're pretty well dated. And, they're mostly coming from the Cascade volcanoes. And so I was like, yes, so here's something. This could be kind of a smoking gun here. And so and then sitting just above the tephra, we found a whole bunch of diatoms, which are like there were freshwater plankton here. And so we sent the tephra off to a lab, and it, lo and behold, correlated with a eruption of Mount St. Helens that happened about 13,000 years ago. That's really well known. It's kind of a nice marker across the Northwest here. And sitting on top of that, those diatoms, they were freshwater diatoms. We had a colleague identify them. And so they tell us here that that probably the flood happened sometime shortly before this eruption of Mount St. Helens. So we had the flood happen, and then Coyote and Lake Alvord had kind of equilibrated, and these diatoms existed just above the ash layer. So let me walk back the sequence here. So we had the flood, the lake levels equilibrated, eruption of Mount St. Helens, and this ash got blown and deposited into the lake. And then on top of that, we have these freshwater diatoms. And these freshwater diatoms are significant because they're telling us that the lakes would have been connected. They wouldn't have been separated because they would be more kind of a different species. The lakes would have been more kind of brackish, more saline. And these diatoms don't live in that kind of that type of environment here. So flood happened a little probably shortly before 13,000 years ago, and just shortly after 13,000 years ago, both the Lakes Alvord and Coyote would have been connected and equilibrated. And so we know the flood dates around 13,000 years old. And one interesting thing about this is this provides if we would have had overflow from Lake Alvord and Lake Coyote down the Crooked Creek and into the Owyhee River, well, the Owyhee flows into the Columbia. And this is one of the first documented instances where we would have had a hydrologic connection between the Columbia River and the Great Basin, of Lakes Alvord and Coyote. And so it could have, hypothetically allowed for some species of fish to migrate from the Columbia up into the Great Basin. Of course, that's more of a story for our biologist friends. And I just want to leave you here with a quote from J. Harlan Bretz, again, who kind of the father of the Missoula floods here. And I thought a lot about him and these other great geologists that I, again, were standing on the shoulders of as I was out getting to map and study this flood. And this just really spoke to me as I was out in the great deserts of southeastern Oregon. Let the observer take the wings of the morning to the uttermost parts of the earth. He will nowhere find its likeness. So thank you. And certainly happy to take questions.
Well,
Yes.
excellent, Deron. Thank you. I was going to try to give a virtual round of applause, but that was the raise my hand button. So excellent. Yeah, thanks a lot. And we'll let Catalin take questions from either the chat or yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah, feel free to come off mute if you'd like to ask your question. You can go ahead and use the little raise hand button. That would be great. Or just put them in the chat and I'll read them out. Whatever's best. But thank you so much, Deron. It was super interesting. Casey says, thank you very much. This is also interesting. So he and I are in agreement on that one. All right, Ben, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, that'd be great.
Oh, there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, I've heard about Bonneville Flood and spilling over into Snake River. Do we know, is it known how much, how stable that sill was? How much did it just kind of spill over like a spillway, like one of the Great Lakes spilling into the next Great Lake? Or did it catastrophically head cut down like a massive washout?
Yeah, and that for the Bonneville flood, is that, Ben? Is
Yeah,
that
yeah, Bonneville.
Yeah. My recollection with the Bonneville flood is I think it was it was kind of less catastrophic. I mean, it was still a huge flood and would have been an enormous amount of water. Like you wouldn't have probably wanted to be in a raft on the Snake River at that time. But I think it was kind of gradual. I don't think there was a huge amount of incision in some, but more of kind of that spillover that you're talking about, as opposed to like a huge kind of collapse or incision. Yeah.
So it spilled over for decades or years?
Yeah, I don't think it was decades. And I'd have to go back and look at Jim's paper, but not, kind of in between, I want to say in the back of my mind, we were looking at in the days to weeks range, but I'd have to just confirm that. But that's kind of just rough time scale there, I think.
Okay, yeah. I mean, like Missoula Dam broke. I've heard about. Yeah, I mean the ice dam broke many times.
Right, right. Yeah, the ice dam would form and recede, and there's some evidence that maybe there was kind of some breaching underneath the ice dam. So that's definitely some research that folks have focused on, is just the actual the mechanism of the collapse of the ice dam of the Missoula floods.
But okay, neat. Yeah. So this one you're talking about here at Alvord, it had cut down a little bit at that sandy gap.
Yeah, a big sand gap. Yeah, and it was probably more, more similar to the Bonneville flood. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So more of kind of that spillover. We didn't see a ton of like catastrophic incision at big sand gap, but just kind of more of a spillway there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one interesting thing too to add is there's been some more research done, and it looks like there might be just all across the Great Basin. So in this research, we found kind of 2 lake high stands in Alvord and Coyote, an older one and a younger one, and they're still early on, but there's some evidence that maybe this was kind of a trend across the entire Great Basin, that we saw, basically lake level rise and fall, and and which would make sense, and just tied to as the climate warmed and cooled during the end of the last glacial maximum. Yeah, Mary Jean, I see your question here. So Mary Jean's question is: you mentioned the Bretz's hypothesis was not well received at first. When did it start to gather steam and eventual acceptance? Was it within his lifetime? So boy, I mean, he was just ridiculed for suggesting that a catastrophic flood could happen. And and this is in the kind of the early part of the 20th century, and it it's just Jim O'Connor has just a phenomenal talk on the history of it, but and I hope someday he writes a book, because it's just there's like political intrigue into it even, but it was towards certainly towards the end of his life that there was more acceptance. And it wasn't really until we could actually take things like satellite imagery and aerial photography to really kind of get the overview of the scale of the Missoula floods. The scale of all three of these types of floods is just so immense that it's just hard to imagine standing around and visualizing this. And even when I have led field trips out to the Crooked Creek area to look at flood deposits, with other geologists, they're like, wow, I'm not sure the scale is just so big. I would have just driven right by it. I would have never really recognized it. So one thing I love about geology is just being able to kind of train your eye to pick out the nuances of the landscape.
Awesome.
Deron, I had a question. You mentioned some of the numbers that you were looking at for the terraces and Crooked Creek didn't match, so you offered a couple of really nice potential corrections. And I like that. It seems to make sense the floodwaters might have carved Crooked Creek down a little bit. Where Highway 95 crosses Crooked Creek, that's a pretty awesome gorge. And there's actually a little bit of state park land that's right there, this little wayside.
Yep.
So folks, anytime that you're driving 95 and you want to break between Burns Junction and Jordan Valley, it's a really neat stop, because it's like a gorge, and it just kind of pops out of nowhere, as oftentimes these Owyhee Canyon lands do. But I'm interested, have you tried to do some of those, like assume that there was X amount of erosion? Do the numbers correct any better if you account for something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't actually do that and we probably should have, or that would be interesting to go back and kind of, run some more models to see that, to kind of see what kind of elevation you would need and how much incision. And boy, off the top of my head, now that you say that, Sammy, there might be something in the paper we published that we discussed that a little, I think. And I can't remember how much. I mean, I want to say it was on the order of like tens of meters of incision. Which could be possible given things like we did look a little at like quantifying what we call the stream power, the amount of work that the stream could do on the landscape.
Yeah, it all sounds really, really great. And I think I hope to get out there sometime with you and see these boulders on the land. Maybe one of these Central Oregon Geology Society field trips, or a Friends of the Owyhee geology field trip, something like that. So Deron, very exciting. Thanks for coming to tell us about it. And I hope we all get to drive by and wave to Crooked Creek and think about this.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a great, thanks for bringing that wayside up. Is a great place to go and contemplate the flood. And it's just right off the highways.
That's awesome. Cool. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we're going to call it a night, an evening. And yeah, Deron, thank you so much again for joining us and for teaching us about this just really interesting geological event, I guess. So yeah, thanks again. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks so
Have a
much.
wonderful
Thanks
evening.
for having me.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Good night. Thanks.
Oops.